I remember that night vividly, even though I was only 5 years old. Some memories never fade, no matter how much you wish they would. It was the first time I saw Santa Claus in real life. At least, it's the first memory I have of a real Santa Claus. It was the winter of 1998, and my mom and I had just moved into a small house on the outskirts of town. The house wasn't big, but it was larger than anything we'd had before. My mom worked tirelessly to make ends meet. During the day, she worked at a bar, and during the holiday season, she took extra shifts at a mall gift wrapping station in the evenings. Since she didn't have anyone to watch me, I'd tag along to the mall. While she worked, I would hang out in the Santa's village area, playing with other kids. The Santa at that mall wasn't like the ones I'd seen in movies or magazines. He was different, always smiling that big, wide grin, with eyes that seemed to watch everything. The kids adored him. He had a way of making them laugh, scooping them up onto his lap for pictures. I did everything I could to catch his attention. I thought, if he likes me, maybe he'll give me the Christmas I've always dreamed of. One afternoon, he finally noticed me. He asked my name, lifted me onto his lap, and told me I must be a very special boy. I remember my heart racing, and over the next few weeks, I noticed he started paying more attention to me than the other kids. He'd ask me things like what I wanted for Christmas, what my house was like, who I lived with, and if I spent much time alone. At the time, I thought it was normal. He was Santa, after all. It was his job to know these things. One day, he told me he needed my address to make sure the presents would arrive on Christmas Eve. "Don't tell your mom," he said, with that same big smile. "This is our little secret. Adults don't understand these things." I agreed, of course. He was Santa Claus, and he said I was special. I was too young to know my address, or even understand what an address really was, but he explained that all I had to do was bring him one of the letters from the pile my mom kept on the kitchen table. He showed me how to grab one when she wasn't looking. The next day, I proudly handed him a letter. I'd executed our plan perfectly, and I could tell he was pleased. As the month went on, his questions grew more detailed. Looking back now, as an adult, I realize how disturbing they were. But back then, they were just questions. He asked if my mom ever went out at night, if I stayed home alone, if our house had a chimney, or if any windows were left unlocked at night. He even asked if I knew how to open windows. I thought he was just making sure he could deliver the presents without any grown-ups catching him, a secret mission of sorts. Then came the night it all happened. It was December 21st, and my mom needed to run out to buy matches. The air was icy cold, and she wanted to light the fireplace. She said she wouldn't be gone more than 10 minutes, and gave me the usual instructions. Don't open the door for anyone, and don't leave the couch. If I needed anything, I should wait until she got back. I promised to behave, but as soon as she left, the doorbell rang. I remembered her warning, but curiosity got the better of me. I did what I'd seen her do countless times. I went to the kitchen and peeked through the window. My heart skipped a beat when I saw who was there. It was Santa Claus. I ran to the door without thinking. He was waving at me, that same wide smile on his face. I knew I shouldn't open the door, but he was Santa. How could I say no? I unlocked the door, opened it, and there he was, dressed in his red suit, holding a small sack. "Can I come in for a bit? It's so cold out here," he said. I hesitated, but he smiled again, and I felt safe. He was Santa, after all. The moment he stepped inside, something changed. The smile felt less warm, and his eyes, those eyes that once seemed so friendly, now had something unsettling in them. I remember thinking he might be hungry. He asked where my mom had gone and how long she'd be gone. When I told him she had just gone down the street for matches, his expression darkened. He seemed annoyed and started rushing things. He explained there'd been a problem at the toy factory, and because I was such a special boy, He needed my help to save Christmas. I was about to take his hand and step outside when we heard the sound of keys in the lock. Then the front door swung open. He grabbed me, hoisted me up, and bolted for the back of the house. That's when I realized something was horribly wrong, and I screamed for my mom. She came running, and when she saw Santa holding me, she started screaming too. He dropped me, hard. I hit the ground, breaking my arm. Then he fled out the back door into the darkness. My mom called the police. I thought I'd be in trouble, that she'd be angry with me, but all she did was hug me tightly, crying the whole time. I never saw him again. But years later, I found out that during that same holiday season, there were reports of a man dressed as Santa Claus approaching kids in malls across the region. 2 of those kids disappeared. The police never caught him, and to this day, especially on Christmas Eve, I wake up in the middle of the night with his face burned into my mind. That wide, unsettling grin, the sack in his hand, and his cold whisper, "It's our little secret." Hey, Horror Spectator here. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on post notifications so you're always in the loop when new videos drop. We post 2 videos every week. If you're really into this content, consider sharing it with your friends. It really helps us grow this community. Now, let's move on to the second story. It was Christmas Eve, and I was finishing up my delivery route in a slightly more remote part of town. This time of year has always been a love-hate thing for me. Work was plentiful, which was good in a way, but it also meant I was overworked, and the physical exhaustion from all the deliveries was intense. I was drained after an overly long day, and the roads were covered in snow. Even inside the car, the cold seeped into my bones. My last delivery of the night was to an unfamiliar address in a secluded area. I'd never been there before, but I knew that part of town was full of old money families, the kind dripping with wealth. When I arrived, what I saw left me stunned. Right there, in the middle of the forest, accessible by only one narrow road, stood an actual palace. It looked like something straight out of a fairy tale, with Christmas lights glowing on every corner, reflecting off the icy surroundings as if the place had been dusted in gold. For a moment, I thought I might be hallucinating. Could there really be this much wealth in one place? The entryway was lined with golden columns, and the main door, an imposing work of solid wood, stood like a masterpiece in its own right. Carrying the package, I approached hesitantly. The house seemed surreal in such an isolated setting. Whoever lived there either had way too much free time or was an absolute Christmas fanatic. Before I could knock, the door swung open, revealing an elegant woman. She was wearing a flawless dress and had a wide smile. A smile so wide, it was unsettling. The warmth from inside hit me immediately, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. The interior of the house was even more extravagant than the exterior. Golden chandeliers hung from the ceiling, luxurious rugs covered the floors, and the air was filled with the scent of spices mingling with something sweet. It was intoxicating. The woman greeted me with an almost over-the-top kindness and insisted I come inside. Her hospitality felt genuine, but there was something about her movements, the way she carried herself, that set me on edge. If I'd been smarter, I would have trusted my gut and left, but I was cold, hungry, and above all, curious to see more of the house. So, I accepted her invitation. As I stepped inside, I realized the house was full of people. It was a massive family with adults, elders, and children all bustling around, seemingly busy preparing for dinner. The smells coming from the dining room were irresistible, a mix of rich sauces, baked bread, and roasted meats. My hunger and curiosity quickly overpowered my initial discomfort, and when they offered me a seat at the table, I couldn't say no. The dining room was grand beyond belief. A long table, draped in embroidered cloths, and set with fine porcelain, stretched across the room under an enormous chandelier. Everyone at the table smiled warmly at me, asking questions about my job, where I was from, and my life in general. Their voices were soft and polite, but there was an odd persistence in the way they pressed for details. When the food was served, it was like nothing I'd ever tasted before. Every dish was a masterpiece, each better than the last. A culinary perfection that momentarily made me forget my unease. But halfway through the meal, I started to feel strange. My head felt heavy, and my senses dulled. I hadn't been drinking, but it felt like I was drunk. I stood up, trying to steady myself, and asked to use the restroom. That's when the atmosphere shifted entirely. One of the men at the table stood abruptly with a glass in his hand, and without any effort to hide it, poured the liquid down my back. Then came a string of apologies. He said it was an accident, that he hadn't meant to. The whole thing was bizarre, but what could I do? Either the guy was nuts, or it really had been an accident, and I was just overreacting. I brushed it off, said it was fine, and asked again for the restroom. They pointed me down a hallway, but as I wandered from door to door, confused by the sheer size of the place, I somehow ended up in the kitchen. The vibe in there was different. While the scent of food was still enticing, there was a metallic, nauseating undertone that set my nerves on edge. I looked around, taking in the meticulously organized counters and bubbling pots on the stove. Something compelled me, and before I could stop myself, I lifted the lid off one of the pots. What I saw nearly made me collapse. Floating in the pot was a human hand. The skin was wrinkled from the heat, and the bone was exposed. My stomach churned violently as the smell hit me, a putrid stench that made my entire body scream to run. I stumbled backward, knocking into a counter. The noise echoed through the kitchen. Seconds later, I heard footsteps, many of them, coming straight for me. Panic gripped me. Without thinking, I ran to the nearest window, shoved it open, and let the freezing night air rush in. Climbing onto the sill, I threw myself out into the snow. The fall was rough, but I got up immediately, ignoring the pain, and bolted toward my car. When I reached it, my heart sank. The tires were completely slashed. There was no way I could drive out of there. With no other options, I turned toward the forest. The sound of voices and footsteps behind me was getting louder. I ran as fast as I could, slipping on the icy ground, branches clawing at my face. My head throbbed, my body felt heavy, but sheer terror kept me moving. I ran for what felt like hours, forcing myself to keep going. If I stopped, the cold would kill me. Eventually, I collapsed against a tree, gasping for air, my heart pounding like a drum. My back burned, a searing, stinging sensation. When I reached back to touch it, the pain was unbearable. I pulled my hand away and saw it was covered in blood. What the hell had they poured on me? By some miracle, I heard the sound of cars and stumbled my way to a road. A passing driver took me to town, where I reported everything to the police and was rushed to the hospital. Later, a doctor told me the substance poured on my back was designed to make meat softer and easier to digest. My blood ran cold. I already knew what that meant. I was going to be their Christmas dinner. The police searched the house, but found no evidence. My car was gone, and the house was spotless. The only proof of what had happened was the state of my back. Over time, I realized the family had nearly unlimited resources. They used their money and influence to turn everything against me, accusing me of slander and extortion. My life fell apart. I lost my job, my sense of normalcy, everything. Eventually, I had to move to another state. But I've never been able to forget that night. Every time I smell spices or roasted meat, the memories flood back. And sometimes, in my nightmares, I see that palace again. Glowing, inviting, waiting for its next guest to join the feast. It was a cold, suffocating night in December. The kind of night where silence felt heavy, pressing against your chest, daring you to breathe too loudly. I was spending Christmas alone that year, not by choice, but by circumstance. My parents had decided to take a cruise, and my sister was snowed in halfway across the country. Our family cabin in the woods, an old relic from my grandparents' time, seemed like the perfect place to escape the world for a while. The cabin sat deep in the forest, a place where the nearest neighbor was miles away. During the summer, the isolation felt serene, almost magical. But in the dead of winter, with the frost clawing at the windows and the trees looming like skeletal giants, it felt different. Like the woods were more alive, watching. Not that I was regretting having gone to the cabin, but I think I was beginning to doubt whether it had been a good choice. The first night was uneventful. I lit a fire in the stone hearth, cooked myself a simple dinner, and sank into an old armchair with a book. The sound of the fire crackling and the occasional creak of the cabin's wooden frame were my only companions. Around midnight, I turned in for the night, swaddled in blankets to keep out the bitter cold. Outside, the wind howled like a mournful spirit, but I convinced myself it was just the loneliness playing tricks on me. It was the second night when things began to feel wrong. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a sharp knocking at the door. Not loud, but deliberate. My heart stuttered as I sat up in bed, straining to hear past the blood pounding in my ears. The knocking came again. 3 knocks, slow and methodical. I hesitated. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night? And why knock so quietly, almost as if they didn't want to wake me? The fire in the hearth had long since died, leaving the cabin shrouded in darkness. I grabbed my phone, but of course, there was no signal this deep in the woods. I began to feel like all the conditions were lining up for a true horror cliché. I'd heard these kinds of stories so many times, but I think there's a tendency to always believe we're immune to everything, as if nothing could hurt us. "Hello?" I called out. "Who's there?" No response. I mustered the courage to approach the door, peering through the peephole. Nothing. Just the snow-covered porch and the endless black of the forest beyond. But when I opened the door, there it was. A single object placed dead center on the porch. A snow globe. I picked it up hesitantly. Inside was a miniature version of a log cabin, eerily similar to mine. Something about it made my skin crawl. Who had left it, and why? In any other context, I'd say it was a nice gesture, leaving something like that on someone's doorstep at Christmas. But when you're alone and are supposed to remain alone, every threat is amplified, and everything becomes a potential danger. That night, sleep eluded me. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind scraping against the windows felt like a warning. I tried to convince myself it was just a prank, maybe some kids who lived nearby, though I knew how unlikely that was. The third night, things escalated. I had locked every door and window, even going so far as to barricade the front door with a chair. As the fire dimmed and the shadows stretched across the walls, I heard it. Not knocking this time, but something heavier. A thud, then footsteps on the roof. My breath caught as I stared at the ceiling, paralyzed. The sound moved, slow and deliberate, from one side of the cabin to the other. Then it stopped. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and stepped outside. I'm not proud of this moment of stupidity, and the truth is, I don't even know why I did such a thing. But the reality is that no matter how much we try to rationalize how our body reacts under stress, we are often confronted with reality only when we actually go through situations. I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's easy to judge in hindsight, but at the time, nothing made sense. Outside the cabin, the air was biting, so cold it felt like needles pricking my skin. The snow reflected the moonlight, making the clearing around the cabin almost unnaturally bright. But the roof was empty. No footprints, no signs of life. Just the suffocating silence of the forest. For a moment, I thought I had imagined everything, and that it must have been the stress of being completely isolated. But then, as I turned to go back inside, I saw them. Footprints in the snow, leading from the woods directly to my bedroom window. They were large, inhuman, like they belonged to something walking barefoot. Yet the shape was distorted. The toes too long, the arch too high. They stopped just beneath the window and didn't lead away. I ran back inside and barricaded myself completely for the rest of the night. I didn't wait for the fourth night. At first light, I grabbed what I could carry and left, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. I never went back to the cabin, never told anyone the full story. It's one of those things that seems half-invented or completely delusional. I knew I couldn't tell my family what I'd seen because they would think I had taken some kind of illegal substance. I had done that once in my 20s, and they never forgave me, using every excuse to remind me of my slip-up. I tried to forget everything, to rationalize that I might have hallucinated and let the stress get the better of me. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear that knock. And deep down, no matter how much I try to find explanations, I know what I saw.